At my own granddaughter's wedding, the name tag waiting for me didn't say grandmother. It said the absent old lady. I noticed it the moment the young woman at the reception table handed it to me with a polite smile that suggested she had no idea what those words meant. The ballroom of the Harborview Hotel in Charleston was glowing with warm light, crystal chandeliers reflecting across white linen tables, the kind of place where everything was meant to feel elegant and joyful. My granddaughter Chloe had always dreamed of a wedding like this. I knew because, for years, I had quietly helped make it possible. I held the small card between my fingers for a moment longer than necessary, reading the words again to be sure my eyes hadn't betrayed me. The absent old lady. The letters were written in neat black calligraphy, the kind people pay extra for so everything looks perfect in photos. For a second, I thought perhaps there had been a mistake at the printing company. But the more I stood there, the more I realized something else. The young woman behind the table had already moved on to greeting the next guest. Around me, people were laughing, greeting each other, adjusting jackets and dresses. No one else seemed surprised by the little card attached to my jacket. I smiled politely, just as I had done my entire life during uncomfortable moments, and pinned the tag carefully to the left side of my navy blue dress. It was a dress my late husband Robert used to say made me look distinguished, which was his gentle way of saying elegant without making me feel old. Robert had been gone 4 years now, but I still heard his voice sometimes when I got ready for important family events. Today had felt important. I had arrived early, hoping to sit quietly before the ceremony began, maybe watch Chloe greet guests, maybe feel that warm sense of family that weddings are supposed to bring. Instead, as I stepped into the ballroom, I noticed the first curious glance. A woman standing near the bar looked down at my name tag, then quickly looked away as if she had seen something awkward. A man beside her leaned slightly closer, his eyes scanning the card, and the corners of his mouth tightened in that subtle way people have when they are trying not to laugh. I continued walking, my heels soft against the polished floor, pretending not to notice anything unusual. The string quartet near the windows was playing a gentle melody. Servers moved gracefully between tables carrying trays of sparkling water and champagne. Everything about the room said celebration. Yet everywhere I went, I could feel it happening again. Eyes dropping briefly to my chest. Whispered comments cut short the moment I came closer. I reached my assigned table and gently pulled out the chair with my name card on it. Margaret Whitmore. At least that part was still correct. I sat down, folded my hands in my lap, and took a slow breath. Because one question kept circling quietly in my mind. After everything I had done for this family, how exactly had I become the absent old lady? I remained seated at the table for a few quiet moments, letting the music and conversation settle around me while my eyes drifted slowly across the ballroom. From where I sat, I could see the tall windows facing the harbor, the afternoon sun reflecting off the water in soft flashes of light that danced across the polished floor. It was beautiful, the kind of setting people remember for the rest of their lives, and I imagined Chloe would treasure photographs from this day for decades. I folded my hands neatly in my lap and reminded myself to keep smiling, because that was what a grandmother was supposed to do at a wedding. Still, the words on the small card pinned to my dress stayed with me like a quiet echo. Absent. The strange thing about that word was how calmly it sat there, as if it described a simple fact rather than something deeply personal. I had always believed absence meant not showing up, not calling, not caring. Yet my memories told a very different story. I remembered the winter Chloe turned 12, when her mother called me late one evening because the school trip to Washington, District of Columbia, had suddenly become too expensive for their budget. The bus alone had been nearly $200, and that did not include meals or the museum tickets. I mailed the check the next morning without saying much about it. Years later, when Chloe was accepted to the University of North Carolina, I quietly covered her first semester of textbooks because Daniel had mentioned how quickly the costs were adding up. I never thought of those moments as grand gestures. They were simply the kinds of things families did for each other. That was why the whispers around me felt so strange now. Across the room, I noticed 2 women standing beside the dessert table, their voices low but not quite low enough. One of them glanced toward me again before leaning closer to the other. I could not hear every word, but I caught enough to understand the tone. Something about how Chloe had mentioned that her grandmother rarely came around. Something about how money sometimes replaced presents. I kept my expression gentle, the way I had practiced over many years of family gatherings. People often assume older women do not notice small things. They assume we are distracted by memories or lost in polite conversation. In truth, age teaches you to observe very carefully. I watched as Linda moved gracefully between tables greeting guests, her pale gold dress shimmering under the chandelier light. My daughter-in-law had always been excellent at hosting events. She laughed easily, touched people lightly on the arm when she spoke, and made everyone feel included. As she passed my table, she paused just long enough to give me a brief smile that did not quite reach her eyes. "Hello, Margaret," she said, as if we had already spoken several times that morning. I returned the smile warmly and wished her a lovely celebration. She nodded and continued walking, already turning her attention to another group of guests. I remained seated, listening to the music rise slightly as the quartet shifted into a brighter piece. The room felt alive with excitement and expectation. And yet the quiet question returned once again, calm and persistent. If I had truly been absent all these years, why did so many of my memories involve showing up exactly when my family needed me most? I sat quietly while the room continued to fill with the soft hum of celebration, the gentle clinking of glasses and warm laughter blending with the music drifting through the ballroom. From my seat, I could see the long table where the wedding cake stood, decorated with white roses and small silver leaves that sparkled under the lights. Someone nearby mentioned that it had been flown in from a famous bakery in Savannah. It did not surprise me. Chloe had always loved beautiful things, and I had always believed she deserved them. As I watched the guests gather, a young couple took the seats beside me, both dressed in elegant evening clothes that suggested they were friends of the groom. They smiled politely at first, the way strangers often do when sharing a table, but a moment later the woman noticed the card pinned to my dress. Her expression changed slightly, not cruel, but uncertain. She leaned closer to her companion and whispered something that made him glance at me again, this time with curiosity. I pretended not to notice, lifting my glass of sparkling water and taking a small sip while I studied the room instead. Near the dance floor, Daniel was standing with several relatives from his side of the family, laughing in that familiar way that reminded me of the boy he used to be when he was young and carefree. For a moment, I allowed myself to simply enjoy the sight of him. No matter how complicated family relationships become, a mother never stops recognizing the child she once carried in her arms. Then I heard my name spoken softly from behind me. Not my first name, but something else. Ghost Grandma. The phrase slipped into the air as lightly as if it were a harmless joke. Two young women stood only a few feet away near the bar, holding their glasses close together as they talked. One of them had her phone open, showing something on the screen, while the other laughed quietly. I did not need to see the screen to understand. The tone alone told me enough. Apparently the story being shared among some of the guests was that I rarely visited, that I preferred sending checks instead of attending birthdays or holidays. According to that version of events, my presence in the room tonight was unusual, almost surprising. I felt the strange weight of that idea settle gently in my chest. Not anger, not embarrassment, just a quiet realization that a story had been written about me without my knowledge. A story that was now traveling from table to table as easily as the waiters carrying trays of champagne. I rested my hands again in my lap and studied the small calligraphy letters on the card attached to my dress. Absent. The music grew brighter as the quartet began another song, and across the room the wedding coordinator signaled that the ceremony would begin soon. Guests slowly started moving toward their seats near the front of the ballroom. I stood carefully, smoothing the fabric of my dress, and walked toward the aisle where family members were expected to sit. As I passed a mirrored column, I caught a brief reflection of myself. The silver in my hair glowed softly under the chandelier light, and the words on the name tag were clearly visible against the dark blue fabric. For the first time that evening, I allowed myself a small, thoughtful smile. Because stories have a curious way of revealing who wrote them. And sooner or later, the truth always finds its moment to speak. The officiant's voice carried gently through the ballroom as the ceremony continued, steady and warm, speaking about commitment, patience, and the quiet strength that holds families together through the years. Guests listened attentively, some smiling, some wiping the corners of their eyes as Chloe and her fiancé stood beneath the arch of white roses. I watched them with the same calm expression I had worn all afternoon, my hands folded neatly in my lap, while the soft music and careful words filled the room. It was a beautiful ceremony. There was no denying that. The sunlight from the tall windows painted the floor in long golden shapes, and the scent of fresh flowers drifted softly through the air. Everything looked exactly the way people imagine weddings should look when they picture them in magazines. And yet my thoughts continued traveling quietly through memories that felt far more vivid than the room around me. I remembered the afternoon Chloe received her college acceptance letter. Daniel had called me that evening sounding both proud and anxious because tuition was higher than they had expected. I did not hesitate. The next morning I visited the bank and arranged the first transfer so Chloe could begin the fall semester without worry. I never told anyone outside the family about that decision. It felt natural to help in whatever way I could. Later there were other moments. When Daniel and Linda struggled during the first year after buying their house, I quietly covered the cost of replacing their aging roof before the winter storms arrived. When Chloe began planning this very wedding almost a year ago, I received a polite call explaining that venues, flowers, and catering were more expensive than expected. I listened carefully, asked a few gentle questions, and then wrote another check so the celebration could continue without stress. I never attended planning meetings or insisted on being involved in decisions. I believed young couples deserved the freedom to create their own day exactly as they imagined it. Now, sitting in the family row while the vows were spoken, I considered how easily generosity can become invisible over time. Perhaps it was not intentional. Perhaps stories shift slowly, shaped by convenience rather than truth. If someone repeats a simple version of events often enough, people eventually accept it without asking many questions. The idea that I rarely visited, that I preferred distance, that I sent help instead of showing up. Those details must have traveled quietly through conversations over the years until they settled into something that sounded believable. The officiant invited the couple to exchange rings, and a soft ripple of applause moved through the guests as Chloe placed the band onto her husband's hand. Daniel looked relieved and proud as he stepped back beside Linda near the front row. Linda held a small bouquet and watched the moment with an expression that appeared perfectly composed. When the officiant announced the marriage and the room erupted into cheerful applause, I stood with everyone else and clapped warmly, my smile sincere, because Chloe did deserve happiness. As the newly married couple walked down the aisle together, guests turned toward the reception tables once again, laughter returning, music beginning to rise with a brighter rhythm. I adjusted the small name tag on my dress before stepping into the flow of people moving toward the celebration. The calligraphy letters still rested there calmly against the fabric. Absent. For a long time I had believed presence meant standing in the room, attending every gathering, appearing in every photograph. But as I followed the guests toward the reception tables, another thought settled quietly in my mind. Presence is not always measured by where you stand. Sometimes it is measured by everything you have already done long before the music begins.